A Messerschmitt Bf 109 screams through the sky over France, 1940. The British Spitfire ahead is trailing smoke, its pilot desperately trying to reach the channel. The German pilot has the kill lined up perfectly. His thumb rests on the firing button. The Spitfire is finished, its engine coughing black smoke, losing altitude with every second. But then the British pilot bails out. The canopy flies off, tumbling through the air. A figure emerges, falling for a heart-stopping moment before his parachute blossoms white against the blue sky. He's helpless now, drifting slowly toward the French countryside below, completely at the mercy of anyone who wants to finish the job. The German pilot's finger hovers over the trigger. One burst would end it. 2 seconds of fire. The parachute would collapse. The British pilot would fall like a stone. It would be easy. It would be legal under the laws of war as they existed then. And it would mean one less enemy pilot to fight tomorrow. Instead, he pulls up and away. His wingmen watch in confusion. They just let an enemy pilot live. A pilot who will be rescued by French resistance, smuggled back to England, and be flying against them again within weeks. But here's what makes this moment extraordinary. This wasn't mercy. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't even compassion, though that played a role. It was leadership. It was a conscious decision about what kind of warrior this pilot wanted to be, and what kind of men he wanted to command. And the decision this pilot made would ripple through his entire squadron, then his wing, then throughout significant portions of the Luftwaffe fighter force, creating an unwritten code that saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives on both sides. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about aerial combat in World War II. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit subscribe and like the video. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one man's sense of honor influenced an entire fighter wing, why the Luftwaffe's most successful aces believed that chivalry in the sky wasn't weakness, but the mark of a true warrior, and how this code of honor created bonds between enemies that lasted long after the war ended. This is the story of Adolf Galland and the last knights of the air, but it's also the story of Werner Mölders, Günther Rall, Johannes Steinhoff, and dozens of other aces who proved that even in the most brutal war in human history, honor could survive. To understand how revolutionary Galland's philosophy truly was, we need to go back to the beginning of aerial warfare itself. When aircraft first appeared over the battlefields of World War I, there were no rules for air combat. The concept of fighting in 3 dimensions was so new that nobody had developed doctrine, tactics, or ethics for it. In the early days of the Great War, pilots initially waved at each other as they passed. They were observers, not fighters. Their job was reconnaissance, spotting enemy troop movements and artillery positions. Some pilots even carried pistols to take pot shots at enemy planes, though hitting anything while flying an unstable aircraft at 70 miles per hour was nearly impossible. But as the war progressed and aircraft became weapons platforms, mounting machine guns and learning to fight, something remarkable happened. Even as the killing intensified, even as aerial combat became deadlier and more sophisticated, a code of honor developed among fighter pilots. Manfred von Richthofen, the legendary Red Baron, refused to shoot at parachuting pilots. This was particularly notable because parachutes were rare in World War I. Most pilots didn't have them. The few who did were usually observation balloon crews. But Richthofen made it clear to his squadron that shooting a man who had abandoned his aircraft was unacceptable. When he shot down an enemy, he would often drop a note over the man's aerodrome confirming the kill and the pilot's fate. If the pilot had survived and been captured, Richthofen would sometimes arrange for personal effects to be returned to the man's unit. Enemy aces who were shot down and survived were sometimes invited to dinner at German officers' messes before being sent to prisoner-of-war camps. This wasn't universal, of course. Plenty of pilots on both sides showed no mercy. The war was brutal, and many men became brutalized by it. But among the elite aces, among the men who survived long enough to become truly skilled, there was a sense that they were all part of an exclusive club. Warriors who understood what it meant to fight in 3 dimensions, where a mechanical failure or a moment's inattention meant death. They respected each other's skill. They understood the courage it took to climb into a flimsy aircraft made of wood and fabric and fight to the death thousands of feet above the ground. And that mutual respect created an informal code of conduct. By the time World War II began, in September 1939, that tradition had largely survived in the Luftwaffe, at least among certain pilots. The German military had a long tradition of professional conduct, of seeing themselves as warriors rather than killers. And no one embodied that old-school warrior code more than Adolf Galland. Born in 1912 in Westerholt, Germany, Galland was obsessed with flying from childhood. He built model aircraft, read everything he could about aviation, and dreamed of becoming a pilot. When he was old enough, he joined gliding clubs, learning to fly in the sailplanes that were popular in Germany during the 1920s and early 1930s. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1934, back when Germany was secretly rebuilding its air force in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty had forbidden Germany from having military aircraft, but the Germans had found ways around the restrictions. They trained pilots in gliding clubs and civilian aviation schools. They developed military aircraft disguised as civilian transports. And by the time Hitler openly repudiated the treaty in 1935, Germany had the foundation of a formidable air force. Galland was part of this new generation of German pilots. He was trained thoroughly, learning not just how to fly, but how to fight. The Luftwaffe invested heavily in its pilots, recognizing that the human element was just as important as the machines they flew. By 1937, Galland was flying combat missions in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, where he flew ground attack missions in support of Franco's nationalist forces. This was Germany's testing ground, where they evaluated tactics and equipment in real combat conditions. Galland flew over 300 missions in Spain, learning the realities of combat aviation. But it was in the skies over France in 1940 that Galland truly made his mark. Flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the backbone of the Luftwaffe fighter force, he quickly racked up victories against French and British aircraft. The Bf 109 was an excellent aircraft, fast, maneuverable, and well-armed. In skilled hands, it was deadly. By June 1940, Galland had 14 confirmed kills. By September, during the Battle of Britain, he had 40. He was becoming one of Germany's most celebrated aces, his name appearing in newspapers, his face on propaganda posters. He was awarded the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. But what set Galland apart wasn't just his skill as a pilot. It was his philosophy about how aerial combat should be conducted. He saw himself as part of a warrior tradition that stretched back centuries. Knights, samurai, duelists, men who fought according to codes that elevated combat above mere killing. And that philosophy was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. May 1940. The German invasion of France is in full swing. The French military, despite having excellent equipment and brave soldiers, is collapsing under the weight of Germany's blitzkrieg tactics. The combination of fast-moving armored columns, close air support, and aggressive infantry tactics is overwhelming French defenses. Galland's Jagdgeschwader 27 is flying multiple sorties per day engaging French and British aircraft over the rapidly collapsing front lines. The fighting is intense, chaotic, and deadly. Pilots are flying 3, 4, sometimes 5 missions per day. The pace is exhausting, but the Germans are winning, and that makes the exhaustion bearable. During one mission over northern France, Galland spots a formation of French Morane-Saulnier fighters. The Morane-Saulnier MS-406 was France's most numerous fighter, but it was outclassed by the Bf-109. Slower, less maneuverable, and more lightly armed, it was at a severe disadvantage in combat. Galland dives on the formation, his wingmen following. The French pilots scatter, trying to evade. Galland locks onto one aircraft, closing the distance. At 200 meters, he opens fire. The Bf-109's twin machine guns and single 20mm of cannon tear into the French fighter. Pieces fly off. Smoke pours from the engine. The aircraft rolls over and begins to fall. Galland pulls up, scanning for threats. His wingmen are engaged with other French fighters. The sky is full of aircraft, twisting and turning, trying to get into firing position or evade enemy fire. Then he sees it. A parachute, white against the blue sky. The French pilot he just shot down has bailed out successfully. His parachute has deployed, and he's drifting slowly towards the ground, maybe 3,000 meters below. Galland's wingman, a young pilot named Klaus, only 21 years old, and on only his third combat mission, positions his aircraft to make a firing pass on the descending parachute. It's an easy shot. The pilot is completely defenseless. One burst and it's over. Over the radio, Galland's voice cuts through, sharp and commanding. "Klaus, break off, do not fire." Klaus hesitates, confused. His finger is on the trigger. "The enemy is right there. This is the enemy. This is war. Why show mercy?" "I said break off. Now." Klaus pulls away, rejoining the formation. The French pilot continues his descent, unmolested. He'll land in a field somewhere, probably be picked up by German ground forces, and spend the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. Or maybe he'll evade capture and make it back to his unit. Either way, he's alive. After they land back at their airfield, Klaus approaches Galland. The young pilot is troubled, uncertain. He's been taught that the enemy must be destroyed, that Germany's survival depends on total commitment, that mercy is weakness. "Sir," he asks carefully, "why did you order me not to shoot? That pilot will fly against us again if he escapes." Galland looks at the young pilot for a long moment. Then he speaks, and his words will echo through the squadron, through the wing, through the entire fighter force. "A pilot in a parachute is defenseless. He is no longer a combatant. He is no longer a threat. He is a man trying to survive. We are fighter pilots, not murderers. We fight aircraft, not men hanging helplessly in the sky." Klaus presses the issue. "But sir, if he survives, if he makes it back to his unit, he'll fly against us again. We'll have to fight him again. Maybe he'll kill one of us." Galland's response is immediate and firm. "Then I will have the honor of fighting him again. But I will not have the dishonor of shooting a defenseless man. Do you understand the difference?" Klaus nods slowly, but Galland can see he's not entirely convinced. So Galland continues, his voice softer now, more reflective. "Listen to me carefully. We are going to fight in this war for years. Some of us will die. That's the nature of combat. But when this war is over, when we go home, we have to be able to live with what we've done. We have to be able to look at ourselves in the mirror. We have to be able to tell our children what we did without feeling shame." He pauses, letting that sink in. Shooting a man in a parachute is murder. It's not combat. It's not honorable. It's not what we are. We are the Luftwaffe. We are professional warriors. We fight with skill and courage, but also with honor. That's what separates us from barbarians." Klaus nods again, And this time Galland can see understanding in his eyes. "I understand, sir." "Good. Now spread the word. No one in this squadron shoots parachutes. Anyone who does will answer to me personally." This wasn't just personal philosophy. Galland was establishing a standard for his entire unit. And here's what makes this truly remarkable. His men followed him. Now, pause for a second and think about this. You're in the middle of a war. Your job is to kill the enemy before he kills you. Every enemy pilot you face is trying to shoot you down, to kill you and your comrades. Your commander tells you to spare enemy pilots who are completely vulnerable, who could be eliminated with a 2-second burst of fire. Does that make sense? Is it naive? Is it dangerous? Or is it something else entirely, something about maintaining your humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter? Keep that question in mind, because what happened next reveals something profound about leadership and moral authority in combat. Word of Galland's policy spread quickly through Jagdgeschwader 27. Pilots talked about it in the mess hall, in their quarters, during the long hours between missions. Some embraced it immediately. These were men who had been uncomfortable with the idea of shooting defenseless enemies, but hadn't known if it was acceptable to refuse. Galland's clear statement gave them permission to follow their conscience. Others were skeptical. They argued that war was war, that the enemy wouldn't show them the same mercy, that every enemy pilot they spared was a potential threat to their own lives and the lives of their comrades. A few thought it was foolish sentimentality that would get Germans killed. These were often the younger pilots, the ones who had grown up entirely under Nazi rule, who had been taught that mercy was weakness and that total commitment to victory was the only acceptable standard. But Galland didn't just issue orders and expect them to be followed blindly. He led by example. Time and again, pilots in his squadron watched him break off attacks when enemy pilots bailed out. They saw him waggle his wings in salute to parachuting enemies, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. They heard him on the radio, reminding younger pilots that honor mattered, even in war. And gradually, the culture of the unit changed. Pilots who might have taken easy kills on parachuting enemies instead followed their commander's example. It became a point of pride. We don't shoot parachutes. We're better than that. We're Galland's men. One incident in particular cemented this culture. A young pilot named Heinz, barely 20 years old, shot at a parachuting British pilot during a mission over the Channel. The burst missed, but the intent was clear. When they landed, Galland called Heinz into his office. What happened in that office was never officially recorded, but Heinz later told other pilots that it was the most terrifying 15 minutes of his life. Galland didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply explained in calm, measured tones exactly what he thought of men who shot defenseless enemies. "You are a disgrace to this squadron," Galland told him. "You are a disgrace to the Luftwaffe. You are a disgrace to Germany. If I ever see you do that again, I will personally ensure you are court-martialed and removed from fighter operations. Do you understand me?" Heinz understood. He never shot at a parachute again. And he told the story to other pilots, spreading Galland's message even further. But Galland wasn't alone in this philosophy. Other Luftwaffe aces shared his views, and their influence spread throughout the fighter force, creating a network of units where this code was the standard. Werner Mölders, who would become the first pilot in aviation history to claim 100 aerial victories, was even more emphatic about the code than Galland. Mölders was deeply religious, a devout Catholic who struggled with the moral implications of killing. He attended Mass regularly, even during combat operations. He prayed before missions and gave thanks when he survived. For Mölders, refusing to shoot parachuting pilots wasn't just about honor. It was about maintaining his humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter. It was about being able to reconcile his actions as a warrior with his faith as a Christian. Mölders commanded Jagdgeschwader 51, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful fighter wings. And like Galland, he made his position clear to every pilot under his command. He gathered his pilots together shortly after taking command and addressed them directly. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are about to fight in a war that will test us in every way imaginable. We will face danger, exhaustion, fear, and loss. Some of us will not survive. But through it all, we must remember who we are. We are not barbarians. We are not murderers. We are warriors, and warriors fight with honor." He paused, looking each man in the eye. "I will tell you this once, and I will never repeat it. If I ever hear of any pilot in this wing shooting at a man in a parachute, I will personally see to it that he is removed from this unit and faces the harshest punishment available under military law. We fight aircraft. We fight armed enemies who are trying to kill us. But we do not murder defenseless men. Is that clear?" It was clear, and like Galland's squadron, Mölders' wing adopted this code as a point of pride. They were Mölders' men, and Mölders' men fought with honor. Günther Rall, who would end the war with 275 confirmed victories, third highest of any pilot in history, shared the same philosophy. Rall was a different personality from both Galland and Mölders. He was more reserved, less charismatic, but equally firm in his convictions. "Shooting a man in a parachute is murder, not combat," he stated flatly to his pilots. "I would rather lose the war than win it that way. We are fighting for Germany, but we are also fighting for our own souls. Don't lose yours for the sake of one easy kill." These weren't minor figures. These were the Luftwaffe's most successful and most respected fighter pilots. Galland, Mölders, and Rall between them would account for over 600 confirmed aerial victories. They were the men other pilots looked up to, the aces whose tactics were studied and emulated, whose opinions carried weight throughout the fighter force, and their influence extended far beyond their own squadrons. Young pilots who served under them and were then transferred to other units carried the code with them. Pilots from other squadrons who heard about the policy began adopting it themselves. Gradually, throughout significant portions of the Luftwaffe fighter force, this code became the standard. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. This code of honor existed despite direct pressure from the Nazi regime to abandon it. By 1941, the war was expanding dramatically. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June, opening up the massive Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in history, involving over 3 million German soldiers and thousands of aircraft, and on the Eastern Front, the rules were different. This was a war of annihilation, a racial war where Nazi ideology demanded the complete destruction of the enemy. Hitler had made it clear that the war against the Soviet Union was not a conventional conflict between nations. It was an ideological struggle between civilizations, and no mercy was to be shown. Luftwaffe pilots flying in the East quickly discovered that Soviet pilots didn't always follow the same code. Some Soviet pilots would shoot at parachuting Germans. Some would strafe pilots who had crash-landed and were trying to escape their burning aircraft. Some would attack clearly marked medical aircraft and ambulances. This wasn't universal. Many Soviet pilots followed the same code of honor that Galland and others advocated. But enough incidents occurred that Nazi propaganda seized on them, using them to justify abandoning any pretense of chivalry. "The Bolsheviks are animals," the propaganda claimed. "They fight without honor, without mercy. They deserve the same treatment they give us, To show them mercy is to betray our comrades who have been murdered by them. Pressure mounted on Luftwaffe commanders to authorize parachuting Soviet pilots. Some units did exactly that, particularly units that had suffered losses to Soviet attacks on parachuting Germans. The desire for revenge was powerful and understandable. But Galland, Mölders, Rall, and other prominent aces refused. They argued passionately with their superiors, with propaganda officials, even with SS officers who accused them of being soft on the enemy. Their reasoning was simple but powerful. "We don't follow the enemy's standard," Galland explained in one heated meeting with a senior Luftwaffe officer. "We set our own. If they choose to fight without honor, that's their decision. But we will not become what we're fighting against. The moment we start murdering defenseless men, we lose any moral authority we might have. We become no better than the worst of them." Mölders put it even more bluntly. "I am a Christian. I believe I will answer to God for my actions in this life. I can justify shooting down enemy aircraft in combat. I cannot justify murdering defenseless men. I will not do it, and I will not order my men to do it. If that makes me a traitor in your eyes, then court-martial me. But I will not compromise on this." This wasn't easy. The pressure was intense. Pilots who watched their friends shot while parachuting wanted revenge. The desire to retaliate was powerful and understandable. Some pilots did retaliate, shooting at Soviet parachutes in violation of their commander's orders. But the influence of commanders like Galland, Mölders, and Rall held the line. They dealt harshly with pilots who violated the code, making it clear that such behavior was unacceptable. They continued to lead by example, continuing to spare parachuting enemies, even on the Eastern Front. And here's what's truly extraordinary. Even as the war became more brutal, even as Germany began losing, even as the Luftwaffe was ground down by overwhelming Allied numbers, this code largely held among the fighter pilots who had adopted it. Johannes Steinhoff, another ace who would survive the war with 176 victories, later wrote about this phenomenon. "We were fighting a war for a regime that committed unspeakable atrocities. We knew this, even if we didn't know the full extent. But we told ourselves that we could remain honorable even while serving a dishonorable cause." Perhaps that was self-delusion. But it was important to us. It was how we maintained our sanity. But the real test of this philosophy came in the skies over Germany itself, when the roles were reversed and German pilots were the ones bailing out over their own territory. By 1943, the strategic situation had completely reversed. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies in 1940, was now fighting a desperate defensive battle against overwhelming Allied air power. American heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators were striking German cities by day in massive formations, sometimes over 1,000 aircraft at a time. British bombers, Lancasters, and Halifaxes were hitting them by night in equally massive raids. And escorting these bombers were swarms of Allied fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and especially P-51 Mustangs. The P-51 Mustang was a game-changer. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers all the way, to Berlin and back, something no previous Allied fighter could do. It was fast, maneuverable, and deadly. And there were thousands of them. German fighter pilots were outnumbered, often by factors of 10 to 1 or more. Fuel shortages meant less training for new pilots. Experienced aces were being killed or wounded at an unsustainable rate. The average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot in 1944 was measured in weeks, sometimes days. In this desperate situation, Galland had been promoted. By November 1941, at just 29 years old, he became General der Jagdflieger, General of the Fighter Pilots, responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations. It was an impossible job. He was expected to defend Germany against an enemy that had virtually unlimited resources, while his own forces dwindled daily. He clashed repeatedly with Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, over the impossible demands being placed on fighter pilots. Göring, who had been a fighter ace himself in World War I, but who had grown fat and complacent in his position of power, refused to accept that the Luftwaffe was being overwhelmed. He blamed the pilots, accusing them of cowardice and lack of commitment. Galland fought back, defending his pilots and demanding better aircraft, more fuel, more training time for new pilots. But the resources simply weren't there. Germany was losing the war, and no amount of courage or skill could overcome the material superiority of the Allies. But even in this position, even with the survival of Germany itself at stake, Galland maintained his code. And he discovered something remarkable. Allied pilots, especially American and British fighter pilots, largely followed the same rules. German pilots bailing out over their own territory were almost never shot at by Allied fighters. There were exceptions, of course. War brings out the worst in some people. Some Allied pilots, particularly those who had lost friends or who had seen the devastation of German cities, did shoot at parachuting Germans. But the overwhelming majority of Allied fighter pilots followed the same code that Galland had established in his own squadrons. They would shoot down German aircraft without hesitation, but once a pilot bailed out, the fight was over. Why? Because many Allied pilots had been trained by men who remembered World War I, who remembered the old code of aerial chivalry. Because shooting a defenseless man felt wrong, even to men who had just been trying to kill each other moments before. And because word had spread through the Allied air forces that the Luftwaffe's top aces didn't shoot parachutes, and there was a sense that this should be reciprocated. What emerged was an unwritten agreement between enemies. In the air, we fight to the death. We use every advantage, every tactic, every weapon at our disposal. But once a pilot leaves his aircraft, the fight is over. He's out of the battle. He's no longer a threat, and to shoot him would be to cross a line from warrior to murderer. Galland later wrote about this phenomenon in his post-war memoirs. "We were trying to kill each other with every weapon at our disposal," he recalled. "We shot down each other's aircraft, knowing that many of the men inside would die in the crash or burn to death. We bombed each other's cities, killing civilians. We fought with a brutality that would have shocked our grandfathers. But there were still lines we would not cross. A pilot in a parachute had crossed that line. He was out of the fight. He was defenseless. To shoot him would be to cross from warrior to murderer, and most of us, on both sides, refused to take that step. But this code was about to face its greatest test. Because as Germany collapsed, as the war entered its final, desperate phase, the pressure to abandon all restraint became overwhelming. By early 1945, Germany was dying. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, having pushed German armies back across Poland and into Germany itself. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine from the west. German cities were being reduced to rubble by round-the-clock bombing. The Luftwaffe was down to a few hundred operational fighters, facing thousands of Allied aircraft. In this apocalyptic environment, Nazi leadership demanded total commitment. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, issued increasingly insane orders. Any pilot who failed to engage the enemy could be court-martialed for cowardice. Any commander who showed weakness could be relieved or worse. Galland himself fell afoul of this paranoia. In January 1945, after one clash too many with Göring over the impossible situation facing the fighter force, he was relieved of his position as general of the fighter pilots. It was a humiliation, a public rebuke to Germany's most famous fighter ace. But even in disgrace, Galland continued to fight and continued to uphold his code. He was given command of Jagdverband 44, an elite unit flying the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. This unit was composed of some of Germany's most experienced aces, men who had survived years of combat and shared Galland's philosophy. The Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, significantly faster than any Allied aircraft. It could reach speeds of over 500 miles per hour, making it nearly impossible for Allied fighters to catch. Flying the Me-262, Galland's pilots could attack Allied bomber formations, shoot down several bombers, and escape before the escorting fighters could react. They could also have easily shot down parachuting Allied airmen and escaped before anyone could retaliate. The temptation must have been enormous. These were the bomber crews who had been destroying German cities, killing German civilians, reducing Germany to rubble. The desire for revenge was powerful, but Galland's influence held. His pilots continued to follow the code. They attacked aircraft, not parachutes. They fought with honor, even as their nation collapsed around them. Galland made this explicit in his first meeting with the pilots of Jagdverband 44. These were all experienced aces, men with dozens or hundreds of kills. They didn't need basic instruction. But Galland felt it was important to establish the unit's culture from the beginning. "Gentlemen," he told them, "we are flying the most advanced aircraft in the world. We have the ability to strike the enemy and escape before they can respond. We will use this advantage to defend Germany for as long as we can, but we will do so with honor. We will fight aircraft, not defenseless men. Is that understood?" It was understood. And even in the final desperate months of the war, Galland's pilots maintained the code. And here's what makes this truly remarkable. Allied pilots noticed. After the war, numerous American and British pilots reported that even in the final desperate months, Luftwaffe fighters would break off attacks when Allied crews bailed out. This wasn't universal, but it was common enough to be noteworthy. One American B-17 pilot, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, was shot down in March 1945 during a raid on Berlin. His aircraft was hit by cannon fire from an Me-262, the entire right wing erupting in flames. He ordered his crew to bail out, then followed them out of the disintegrating bomber. As he descended in his parachute, Johnson watched the Me-262 circle back. For a terrifying moment, he thought the German pilot was lining up to shoot him. He was completely helpless, hanging in his parachute harness, unable to evade or defend himself. But the Me-262 didn't fire. Instead, it circled his parachute once, close enough that Johnson could see the pilot in the cockpit. The German pilot waggled his wings, a gesture Johnson recognized as a salute, and then flew away. Johnson later wrote about this experience. "I couldn't believe it. This man had just destroyed my aircraft and killed at least 2 of my crew. But he wouldn't shoot me while I was helpless. I never forgot that." After the war, I tried to find out who that pilot was, but I never succeeded. I wanted to thank him for sparing my life. This is the power of leadership. Galland and the other aces who shared his philosophy didn't just influence their own squadrons. They influenced the entire culture of aerial combat. They proved that even in total war, even when national survival is at stake, it's possible to maintain standards of conduct. But the story doesn't end with Germany's surrender, because what happened after the war reveals the true impact of this code of honor. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich, which Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years, had lasted just 12. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist. Its aircraft were destroyed or captured. Its pilots became prisoners of war, facing an uncertain future. Many expected harsh treatment, even war crimes trials. The Nuremberg trials were beginning, prosecuting Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity. Some Luftwaffe officers were prosecuted, particularly those involved in atrocities against civilians or prisoners of war. But something unexpected happened with the fighter pilots. Allied air forces, especially the Americans and British, treated captured Luftwaffe fighter pilots with remarkable respect. Not the SS, not the concentration camp guards, not the Gestapo. Those men faced justice, and rightly so. But the fighter pilots, especially the aces, were treated as fellow professionals who had fought honorably. Why? Because the code of honor that men like Galland had maintained throughout the war had created mutual respect. Allied pilots knew that Luftwaffe fighters had generally fought cleanly. They knew about the unwritten rule against shooting parachutes. They knew that when they had been shot down over Germany, they had usually been treated correctly as prisoners of war, in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. This mutual respect had profound consequences. When the Cold War began and West Germany was rearmed as part of NATO, guess who helped rebuild the new German Air Force? Former Luftwaffe aces, including many of the men who had served under Galland, Mölders, and Rall. Galland himself never flew for the new Luftwaffe. He became an aviation consultant and businessman, advising aircraft manufacturers and air forces around the world. But he advised on the formation of the new German Air Force, and many of his former pilots became its core leadership. And the code of honor he had established became part of its institutional culture. The new Luftwaffe was built on the principle that professional competence and ethical conduct were equally important, that how you fought mattered as much as whether you won. But more than that, Galland became a respected figure in international aviation circles. He attended air shows and reunions where he met former enemies. He developed friendships with Allied pilots who had fought against him. He wrote extensively about aerial combat, and his writings influenced military aviation doctrine for decades. His memoir, The First and the Last, published in 1954, became required reading at military academies around the world. In it, he wrote candidly about his experiences, about the mistakes Germany made, about the impossible situation the Luftwaffe faced, and about the importance of maintaining honor even in the most desperate circumstances. In 1965, Galland traveled to the United States at the invitation of the Air Force Association. He met with American fighter pilots, including some who had flown against him. The reception was warm, even enthusiastic. These former enemies swapped stories, compared notes on tactics, and discussed the future of air combat. One American pilot, Colonel Francis Gabreski, a P-51 ace who had shot down 28 German aircraft, asked Galland directly about the code against shooting parachutes. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "You could have killed more of us. You could have reduced the number of experienced pilots we had. Why show mercy?" Galland's response was characteristically direct. "Because I wanted to be able to look at myself in the mirror after the war. Because I wanted my men to remain human beings, not killing machines. And because I believed that how we fought mattered as much as whether we won." He paused, then continued. "I knew we were losing the war by 1943. It was obvious to anyone who looked at the numbers honestly. We were outnumbered, outproduced, and running out of fuel and pilots. But I also knew that after the war, we would have to live with what we had done. I wanted to be able to live with myself." Gabreski nodded slowly. "I'm glad you felt that way," he said quietly. "I was shot down over Germany in July 1944. Mechanical failure, not combat. I crash-landed behind German lines. German soldiers captured me, But they treated me correctly. I spent the rest of the war in a POW camp, but I was treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. I've always been grateful for that." Galland smiled. "That's how it should be. We were enemies, but we were also professionals. There's no reason we can't respect each other." This is the real legacy of Galland's code. Not just the lives saved, though that matters enormously, but the proof that even in the most brutal circumstances, human decency can survive. That leadership matters, that the example set by those in command ripples outward in ways that can't always be measured but are nonetheless profound. But here's what makes this story even more powerful. Galland wasn't unique. The code he represented was shared by aces on both sides of the conflict, creating a network of mutual respect that transcended national boundaries. Consider the story of Franz Stigler, another Luftwaffe ace who embodied this same code. In December 1943, Stigler encountered a badly damaged B-17 bomber limping back to England after a raid on Bremen. The bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Charlie Brown, was so shot up it could barely fly. Its nose was destroyed, its tail gunner was dead, several other crew members were wounded, and it was flying far below its normal altitude. Stigler could have shot it down easily. It would have been his 28th kill, earning him the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. The bomber was completely defenseless. Its guns were destroyed or unmanned. It couldn't evade. It was a sitting duck. Instead, Stigler flew alongside it, close enough that the American crew could see him clearly. He gestured for them to land in Germany, where they would become prisoners, but would survive. When Brown refused, shaking his head and pointing toward England, Stigler made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had found out. He escorted them toward the North Sea, protecting them from other German fighters and anti-aircraft guns. He flew alongside them for several minutes, then waggled his wings in salute and turned back toward Germany. The B-17 made it back to England. All the surviving crew members lived. Why? Because Stigler had been trained by men who believed in the old code. Because his first commander, a veteran of World War I, had told him, "If I ever hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." Because even in the middle of a war, some things were more important than victory. The American pilot, Charlie Brown, never forgot. After the war, he spent decades trying to find the German pilot who had spared his crew. He placed ads in aviation magazines, contacted veteran organizations, searched through records. In 1990, after 47 years of searching, he finally succeeded. Stigler was living in Canada, having immigrated after the war. Brown contacted him, and the two men met. They became close friends, attending air shows together, giving talks about their experience, demonstrating that former enemies could become brothers. They remained close friends until both died in 2008, within months of each other. At Stigler's funeral, Brown's family was there. At Brown's funeral, Stigler's family was there. The bond created by that one act of mercy had lasted a lifetime. This is the power of honor in combat. It creates bonds that transcend nationality, ideology, even the trauma of war itself. Or consider Günther Rall, who survived the war with 275 victories and later became a key figure in rebuilding the German Air Force as part of NATO. Rall was shot down 8 times during the war. 3 times he was badly wounded, including a crash that broke his back and left him in a body cast for months. And yet he maintained throughout his career that shooting parachuting pilots was unacceptable. After the war, Rall worked closely with American and British air forces. He became friends with numerous Allied pilots, including some who had fought against him. At a reunion in the 1970s, a British pilot who had flown Spitfires during the war asked him if he had ever been tempted to shoot at parachuting enemies, especially after he himself had been shot down and wounded. Rall's response was immediate. Of course I was tempted. I'm human. When you've been shot down, when you've been wounded, when you've watched your friends die, the desire for revenge is powerful. But temptation is not the same as action. We are defined by what we do, not by what we feel. I chose to remain a warrior, not a murderer. The British pilot nodded. I shot you down once, you know. September 1944. Over Holland. You were flying a Bf 109. I was in a Spitfire. I got on your tail and put a burst into your engine. You bailed out. Rall looked at him in surprise. That was you? That was me. I watched you bail out. I could have shot you in your parachute. I thought about it. You'd shot down several of my squadron mates. But I couldn't do it. It felt wrong. Rall extended his hand. Thank you for that. I'm glad we can meet as friends now instead of enemies. They shook hands. Two old warriors who had tried to kill each other decades before, but who shared a code that made friendship possible. These men, Galland, Mölders, Rall, Stigler, Steinhoff, and dozens of others like them, proved that it's possible to fight with honor even in the most dishonorable of wars. They proved that leadership matters, that the example set by commanders influences the behavior of those they lead in profound ways. But they also proved something else. They proved that the enemy is not always evil, that the men trying to kill you might share your values, your sense of honor, your understanding of what it means to be a warrior rather than a killer. This is an uncomfortable truth. It's easier to see war in black and white, good versus evil, us versus them. But the reality is more complex. The Luftwaffe fought for a monstrous regime that committed unspeakable atrocities. The Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, was happening while these men flew their missions. But individual Luftwaffe pilots were not necessarily monsters. Many were professional soldiers who tried to maintain their humanity in inhuman circumstances. This doesn't excuse the regime they served. It doesn't minimize the evil of Nazism. But it does remind us that human beings are complex, that even in the worst circumstances, individuals can make moral choices that matter. And it raises profound questions about leadership, about influence, about how the example we set affects those around us. Think about Galland's young wingman Klaus in 1940, the one who was about to shoot a parachuting French pilot until Galland ordered him not to. That young pilot went on to fly hundreds of combat missions. How many times did he spare a parachuting enemy because of what Galland taught him that day? And how many of his wingmen followed his example because they saw him follow Galland's? This is how moral codes spread, not through lectures or regulations, but through example, through leaders who demonstrate through their actions what they believe is right, through the cumulative effect of hundreds of small decisions that, taken together, create a culture. Adolf Galland died in 1996 at the age of 83. His funeral was attended by former Luftwaffe pilots, by Allied veterans who had fought against him, by aviation enthusiasts from around the world. The eulogies emphasized not just his skill as a pilot, he had 104 confirmed victories, but his character as a man, his insistence on fighting with honor, his refusal to compromise his principles even when it would have been easier to do so. One speaker, Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson, the RAF's top-scoring ace against the Luftwaffe with 38 victories, put it simply. Adolf Galland was my enemy. He tried to kill me, and I tried to kill him. We fought each other in the skies over Europe for years. But he was also my brother in arms. He understood what it meant to be a warrior. He knew that how we fight defines who we are. The world is poorer for his passing. This is the ultimate legacy of the code that Galland and others like him maintained. Not just the lives saved, though that matters. Not just the mutual respect between former enemies, though that matters too. But the proof that even in the darkest circumstances, human decency can survive. That leadership matters. That the choices we make, even small ones, ripple outward in ways we can't always predict, but that nonetheless shape the world. Today, military aviation academies around the world teach the story of Galland and the Luftwaffe aces who refused to shoot parachuting pilots. It's used as a case study in military ethics, in leadership, in the importance of maintaining standards even under extreme pressure. The code these men established has become part of international law. The Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibit attacking parachuting aircrew who are descending from disabled aircraft. It's considered a war crime. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because men like Galland proved that such a code was possible even in total war. But the real lesson isn't about military law or aviation history. It's about human nature. It's about the fact that we always have choices, even when it seems like we don't. Even in war, even when our survival is at stake, even when everyone around us is compromising their principles, we can choose to maintain our standards. Galland chose honor over expedience. He chose to lead by example rather than by decree. He chose to treat his enemies as fellow warriors rather than as targets to be destroyed by any means necessary. And his choice influenced hundreds of pilots, saved hundreds of lives, and created a legacy that endures decades after his death. Here's my question for the veterans and history buffs watching. If you were in Galland's position, commanding fighters in a desperate war, would you have maintained this code? And for those who have served in combat, have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between what was easy and what was right? How did you decide? Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment, and the best discussions often become future video topics. If this story fascinated you, you need to hear about the German U-boat captain who surfaced to save enemy sailors, even though it meant exposing his submarine to attack. That story reveals even more about honor in warfare. Hit subscribe because next week's episode will blow your mind. Until then, remember that history is full of surprises, and the most important lessons often come from the stories of individuals who chose to remain human in inhuman circumstances. The choices we make define who we are, and the example we set influences others in ways we may never fully understand. Adolf Galland understood that. Werner Mölders understood that. Günther Rall understood that. And their legacy reminds us that honor matters, even in war, especially in war. Because if we lose our humanity in the fight, then what exactly are we fighting for?